Prince Quentyn Martell of Dorne is the eldest son of Prince Doran Martell. Under Dornish law, he stands second in succession behind his sister, Arianne. At 18 years old, Quentyn embodies the unremarkable second son. Plain, bookish, dutiful, socially awkward. In a conventional story, Quentyn would be the overlooked underdog who rises to become a hero. He is the physical manifestation of every fantasy trope that A Song of Ice and Fire systematically deconstructs. In this story, he becomes a cautionary tale about the fatal consequences of confusing narrative convention with reality. Quentyn's mission is the culmination of his father's decades-long project. He's supposed to travel to Meereen and marry Daenerys Targaryen to restore the alliance between House Martell and House Targaryen and avenge his aunt Elia Martell. The journey proves uncomfortable from the start. When Quentyn finally presents his marriage contract to Daenerys, a document that she never signed or even knew existed, she politely but firmly refuses him. Faced with a complete failure and unable to bear the perceived shame, Quentyn attempts to steal one of her dragons. He approaches Rhaegal and Viserion with a whip, the tool of a slaver. The dragons respond accordingly. His final chapter, The Dragon Tamer, ends in dragonfire and agony. The subsequent chapter, called The Queen's Hand, confirms his death 3 days later. Some readers, notably Preston Jacobs, have constructed elaborate theories arguing that Quentyn actually survived. This essay will demonstrate why such theories fundamentally misread the text, ignore established narrative patterns, contradict medical reality, and miss the thematic purpose of Quentyn's death. The argument proceeds in 3 parts. First, examining Quentyn's death. Second, addressing the impossibility of survival. And third, exploring why Quentyn's death is a good thing, actually. Hey everyone, an important preface before we get into the rest of the video. I try as much as possible to avoid contemporary politics on this channel, as I feel it can dilute some of the more important, deeper points that I try to get to in my essays, but to understand Quentyn Martell, we have to talk about gender expectations, specifically male expectations. And unfortunately, that means wading into some contemporary conversations about politics in the third part of the essay when discussing the thematic implications of his death. And it also unfortunately means that my comment section in this video is going to be probably a war zone. In this analysis, I will make references to Quentyn's male ego, and I want to clarify what that means, because some people might have knee-jerk reactions to that kind of phrasing. I'm not saying that all men have an ego like Quentyn, like this is some kind of ego that you inherently have as a man. I'm specifically talking about Quentyn's internalized notions of what he thinks that masculinity demands. The need to prove himself as a hero with dramatic feats and to secure Daenerys to validate his own worth as a man. We're not talking about ego that men have in general. We're specifically talking about Quentyn's ego with regard to what he thinks of men and of himself as a man. When I say male ego in Quentyn's context, I'm referring to the internalized script of masculinity that he's trying to perform. It's the bundle of societal expectations that he's absorbed about what a prince, a son, and a man has to be. His male ego is his personal investment in that script. So, just to clarify one more time, when I say male ego, I am referring to Quentyn's ego, which he has entwined with his ideas of being a male, hence male ego. Okay, hopefully that clears things up. I already know that there's going to be people in my comments section doing all kinds of nasty things, but for most people, hopefully that clears things up, and we're going to move on to the rest of the essay. The chapter, called The Dragon Tamer, provides explicit description of Quentyn's death. Quentyn turned and threw his left arm across his face to shield his eyes from the furnace wind. Rhaegal, he reminded himself. The green one is Rhaegal. When he raised his whip, he saw the lash was burning, his hand as well. All of him was burning. Oh, he thought. Then he began to scream. This happens simultaneously with the events of The Kingmaker, Barristan Selmy's perspective during the same chronological period. Martin signals this temporal overlap through repeated environmental details like the rain. As Barristan waits in darkness to execute his coup, he observes that, outside the pyramid, it began to rain. Quentyn experiences this same rain in his chapter. He could hear the soft sounds of falling water, and later, by the time the hour of the wolf crept upon them, the rain was falling steadily, slashing down in a hard, cold torrent that would soon turn the brick streets of Marine into rivers. At the end of the Kingmaker, occurring simultaneously with Quentyn's burning, Barristan receives devastating news. Dragons. The dragons have been loosed, sir. The text provides no evidence that Quentyn escaped on Dragonback, and in fact confirms the opposite. Both dragons remain riderless. We know this because Martin has established that witnesses can identify a ridden dragon versus a loose, wild one. In The Queen's Hand, Barristan insists about Daenerys. Daenerys is not dead. She was riding that dragon. I saw it with mine own 2 eyes. Her hair was afire. I saw that too. She was burning, and if I did not see her fall, hundreds swear they did. The contrast is deliberate. When someone rides a dragon, witnesses can tell. No one reports seeing a rider on Rhaegal or Viserion in A Dance with Dragons. And no one reports seeing a rider on either dragon in Barristan and Tyrion sample chapters in The Winds of Winter either. The Queen's Hand chapter confirms the horrific aftermath. The Dornish prince was 3 days dying. He heard the prince's death rattle coming from the queen's apartments. At his command, Quentyn Martell had been laid out in the queen's own bed. He had been a knight and a prince of Dorne besides. It seemed only kind to let him die in the bed he had crossed half a world to reach. The bed was ruined. Sheets, covers, pillows, mattress, all reeked of blood and smoke. But Sir Barristan thought Daenerys would forgive him. Missandei sat at the bedside. She had been with the prince night and day, tending to such needs as he could express, giving him water and milk of the poppy when he was strong enough to drink, listening to the few tortured words he gasped out from time to time, reading to him when he fell quiet, sleeping in her chair beside him. Sir Barristan had asked some of the queen's cupbearers to help, but the sight of the burned man was too much for even the boldest of them. And the Blue Graces had never come, though he'd sent for them 4 times. Perhaps the last of them had been carried off by the pale mare by now. The tiny Nathi scribe looked up at his approach. "Honored sir, the prince is beyond his pain now. His Dornish gods have taken him home. See, he smiles." After the girl was gone, the old knight peeled back the coverlet for one last look at Quentyn Martell's face, or what remained of it. So much of the prince's flesh had sloughed away that he could see the skull beneath. His eyes were pools of pus. This is the textual reality. Any theory asserting Quentyn's survival must contend with this direct evidence that he's dead. As a reminder, the Blue Graces are Giscari healing priestesses. They live in the Temple of Graces that Sir Drinkwater tells Quentyn to visit in the Dragon Tamer chapter. On the orders of Daenerys, the Blue Graces were sent outside the city walls to help with sick people suffering from the Bloody Flux, also known as the Pale Mare. Some theories argue that the charred body isn't Quentyn, but actually an unnamed sellsword swapped in to fake his death. They rest their case on 2 pillars. The chaotic aftermath created an opportunity for the swap, and the smile on the corpse's face, arguing that Quentyn wasn't the type of person to smile, therefore the body cannot be his. This argument collapses under scrutiny. Pointing out the smile actively backfires, transforming into some of the strongest evidence that the body is unequivocally Quentyn's body, and that his death involved more than Dragonfire alone. The theorists are correct that Quentyn isn't the kind of man who smiles, but they're wrong about what this means. A corpse smiling against the character of the deceased person is a documented phenomenon in this world that we've experienced before. The signature of a specific cause of death. Poison. Consider Tywin Lannister. Like Quentyn, Tywin Lannister was not a man known to be smiling, but his corpse smiles at his funeral. Grand Maester Pycelle offers a weak explanation. As the flesh dries, the muscles grow taut and pull his lips upward. That is no smile, only a drying, that is all. But the text wants us to question this explanation. Tywin's body also emits an unusually powerful stench, noted by multiple characters who have experienced death and funerals before. Something is uniquely wrong with his corpse. These signs, the out-of-character smile and accelerated rot, are textual hallmarks of the tears of Lee, the poison that killed Jon Arryn. Quote, "This is a crueler poison, but tasteless and odorless, hence easier to hide. The tears of Lee, men call it. dissolved in wine or water, it eats at a man's bowels and belly, and kills as a sickness of those parts. This precedent reframes everything. Quentyn's smile isn't evidence of a switched identity, it's evidence of poisoning, in addition to the burns. While the main established symptom of the Tears of Lee is the destruction of the digestive system, the poisoning also presents secondary symptoms. These are evident in the account of Lord John Arryn's death. Grand Maester Pycelle notes that in his final days, Arryn suffered from a pronounced fever. Quote, "In the last stage of his fever, the hand called out the name of Robert several times, but whether he was asking for his son or for the king, I could not say." This fever likely contributed to the delirium and confusion described in other accounts of Arryn's demise, where the victim appeared dazed and confused and struggled to speak coherently, if at all. Therefore, beyond its fatal attack on the bowels and belly, the poison induces a suite of symptoms that look like a devastating sickness, effectively masking the true cause of death. The evidence for Quentyn's poisoning is documented on the page, in front of our eyes, in The Dragon Tamer. The chapter opens with Quentyn drinking wine that's been sitting unattended in his solar, the perfect vehicle for the Tears of Lee. Finally, despairing of rest, Quentyn Martell made his way to his solar, where he poured himself a cup of wine and drank it in the dark. The taste was sweet solace on his tongue, so he lit a candle and poured himself another. Wine will help me sleep, he told himself, but he knew that was a lie. As the night progresses, a cascade of symptoms overtakes him, each aligning with the poison's symptoms. Headache, lightheadedness, gastrointestinal distress, general malaise, impaired judgment, and difficulty speaking. After a bit of time passes, around the hour of the wolf, the symptoms begin in earnest. The follies and failures of Aegon the Unworthy did not concern him, but he was full of doubts and misgivings. The labored banter of his friends was only making his head ache. After this headache, Quentyn's symptoms continue to rapidly get worse. Quote, "Very good." Quentyn felt lightheaded. None of this seemed quite real. One moment it felt like a game, the next like some nightmare, like a bad dream where he found himself opening a dark door, knowing that horror and death waited on the other side, yet somehow powerless to stop himself. His palms were slick with sweat. He wiped them on his legs and said, "There will be more guards outside the pit." There was a cramp in Quentyn's belly. He felt a sudden need to move his bowels, but he knew he dare not beg off now. Quentyn stared transfixed, his belly roiling. His own blade was still in its sheath. He had not so much as reached for it. His eyes were locked on the sergeant dying before him, jerking. The fallen torch was on the floor, guttering, making every shadow leap and twist in a monstrous mockery of the dead man's shaking. The prince never saw the locust spear coming towards him until Garrus slammed into him, knocking him aside. The spear point grazed the cheek of the lion's head he wore. Even then, the blow was so violent it almost tore the mask off. It would have gone right through my throat, the prince thought, dazed. The dragons, Prince Quentyn thought. Yes, we came for the dragons. He felt as though he might be sick. What am I doing here? Quentyn drinks some wine that was sitting out in the dark, gets a headache, becomes lightheaded, then experiences gastrointestinal distress, his judgment rapidly deteriorates, and his coordination fails. During the fight with the guards, he stands paralyzed and transfixed in a daze, despite his combat training as a knight. By the time he faces the dragons, he's fully compromised, and his speech increasingly fails him. Garrus and the others are saved from the Tears of Lee because Quentyn insists that they don't drink any wine before the heist. By the time the hour of the wolf crept upon them, the rain was falling steadily, slashing down in a hard, cold torrent that would soon turn the brick streets of Meereen into rivers. The three Dornishmen broke their fast in a pre-dawn chill, a simple meal of fruit and bread and cheese, washed down with goat milk. When Garrus made to pour himself a cup of wine, Quentyn stopped him. No wine. There will be time enough for drink afterward. The most compelling suspect behind the poison is Skahazmo Kandak, the shave page. As head of the Brazen Beasts, he controls access to the pyramid's lower levels, including the Dragon Pit. He's a ruthless political operator who opposed Daenerys' peace with the Yunkai and would benefit from a dead Dornish suitor and unleashed dragons to escalate the conflict. The sequence of events is that Quentyn Martell was first poisoned with the Tears of Lee. Then he was caught in dragonfire while in a weakened, impaired state. The smile on his corpse is the signature of the poison, a final clue to the conspiracy. It also explains why his companions are reluctant to provide detailed testimony in the Queen's Hand chapter. They suspect that the man who tried to poison their prince is in the room with them. Any theory of Quentyn's survival must contend not only with the explicit descriptions of his burning and the identified corpse, but also with his poisoning. The smile doesn't prove that he was swapped. It proves that the body was Quentyn's, and that multiple forces conspired to ensure that he never left Meereen alive. Quentyn is dead. Accept it. Theories that Quentyn survived are centered on a fundamental misunderstanding of the distinction between dragon breath and dragon fire. Earlier in the Dragon Tamer chapter, Quentyn encounters what the text calls furnace wind, the ambient heat produced by a dragon simply by opening its mouth. Quote, "Then the dragon opened its mouth, and light and heat washed over them. Behind a fence of sharp black teeth he glimpsed the furnace glow, the shimmer of a sleeping fire 100 times brighter than his torch." This passage describes dragon breath as the passive heat emanating from a dragon's internal fire. This is the idle state, producing tremendous heat comparable to standing near an open furnace. When Quentyn later raises his left arm in front of his face, he's bracing for what he expects will be another wave of breath heat, because he's caught in his own delusions of grandeur. He's fatally wrong. What follows is actually dragon fire, the active attack state. The text makes this distinction clear throughout the series. When Quentyn feeds Rhaegal a sheep earlier in the same chapter, the dragon uses the active dragon flame. Quote, "The sheep was burning before it began to fall. Before the smoking carcass could strike the bricks, the dragon's teeth closed around it. A nimbus of flames still flickered about the body. The air stank of burning wool and brimstone." Dragon stink. The dragon burns the sheep with flame before consuming it. This same flame is what engulfs Quentyn. The subsequent description in the Queen's Hand chapter confirms that he suffered the full effects of dragonfire: melted eyes, charred flesh, and death within days. Beyond the sheep incident, we witness Viserion killing a sellsword who attempts to shoot him. The crossbowman was fumbling for another quarrel as the dragon's teeth closed around his neck. The man wore the mask of a brazen beast, the fearsome likeness of a tiger. As he dropped his weapon to try to pry apart Viserion's jaws, flame gouted from the tiger's mouth. The man's eyes burst with soft popping sounds, and the brass around them began to run. The dragon tore off a hunk of flesh, most of the sellsword's neck, then gulped it down as the burning corpse collapsed to the floor. After a moment, he forgot the sellswords, and bent his neck to tear another mouthful from the dead man, a lower leg this time. These dragons burn their prey, then eat it. The environment of the dragon pit reinforces this reality. The chapter describes, quote, "blackened bones, twists of metal, partly melted, scattered throughout the pit. The flames are hot enough to melt both metal and brick. The notion that Quentyn, lying burned and helpless in front of two hungry dragons with an established habit of eating men, somehow escaped this fate requires ignoring everything the text tells us about these creatures. Survival theories often point out that we never witness Quentyn's actual death on the page. This observation misunderstands how Martin structures death in the series. Many characters we accept as definitively dead never die within a POV chapter, or even on the page itself. All of the prologue POV chapters are dead, but they don't typically die in their own POV chapter. In another example, we never actually witness Ned Stark's death. It's just implied by the birds fluttering away. And Jon Snow dies at the end of Dance of Dragons, even though we don't actually witness him dying on the page itself. It's just kind of implied by the fact that he's been stabbed a bunch of times and that the chapter abruptly ends. The series has, by my count, only 2 confirmed fake-out deaths where a character appears to die at the chapter's end. Tyrion at the Battle of the Blackwater in A Clash of Kings, and Brienne in A Feast for Crows when Biter tries to bite off her face. The commonality between these examples is that both fake-outs are resolved within the same book, often within chapters. In other words, they're not fake-out deaths. Quentyn's case follows these patterns. We have explicit textual confirmation of his body being burned, and then his burned body surviving 3 days before he dies. This is a resolution, the opposite of a fake-out. The text closes the door to the possibility of him surviving. Quentyn's survival does not align with the medical and practical impossibilities of what follows. Dragonfire produces heat intense enough to melt both metal and brick. When such heat contacts human flesh, it would cause catastrophic damage. Understanding what happens when a human body burns is critical to evaluating Quentyn's fate. Forensic research on human combustion provides clear evidence of how bodies respond to fire. Scientific studies conducted by Dr. Elaine Pope at the University of West Florida have established the mechanics of human bodies burning. According to fire investigator John DeHaan, who collaborated on this research, a human limb burns a little like a tree branch. The process unfolds in stages. In the first stage, the outer layer of the skin fries and peels away. After about 5 minutes of sustained heat, the thicker layer of skin underneath shrinks and splits, allowing the underlying fat to leak out. This fat then becomes fuel for the fire. Like wax in a candle, body fat requires a wick, which can be clothing, hair, or charred tissue, to draw it into the flame where it vaporizes and burns. Once this process begins, a body can sustain its own fire for about 7 hours. The heat causes muscles to contract and dry, making limbs move involuntarily during the process. Bone takes longer to burn, but eventually the skeleton is laid bare. The assertion that human flesh can't burn because it contains water is scientifically illiterate. Pope's research demonstrates conclusively that human bodies do burn, and they burn efficiently once the fat layer is exposed to sustained heat. The water content of tissue is irrelevant when temperatures reach the point where that water boils away and the fat beneath ignites. Historical evidence reinforces this reality. During the Vietnam War, a conflict that Martin lived through as a conscientious objector, American television broadcast footage of people burning alive on national TV. The self-immolation of
Thích Quảng Đức
in 1963 provides photographic documentation that human flesh burns when subjected to sufficient heat. His body sustained flames for several minutes, remaining upright as the fire consumed him. In the context of Dragonfire, with heat intense enough to melt both metal and brick, Quentyn would burn far more rapidly and thoroughly than in an ordinary fire. The temperatures described in the Dragon Pit exceed anything in Pope's controlled experiments. Third-degree burns destroy all layers of skin. At fourth-degree burns extend through the skin and fat into muscle and bone. At the temperatures involved with Dragonfire, Quentyn would suffer catastrophic burns over his entire body within seconds, not minutes. The text seems to confirm this outcome. The Queen's Hand chapter describes a charred body with melted eyes, physical evidence of exposure to extreme heat. The description is consistent with complete thermal destruction of the surface tissue, precisely what Dragonfire would accomplish. The claim that Quentyn would die instantly from these burns is also false. Pope's research and historical evidence both demonstrate that people remain conscious and alive during their burning for far longer than you might expect. The initial shock and adrenaline response can delay the perception of pain. Fire victims have been documented surviving for several minutes or even hours after severe burns, although survival beyond a few days with total body burns in a medieval setting would be impossible. If we assume that Quentyn survived, his escape is skipped over by the witnesses in their testimony. Quentyn is unlikely to have escaped by himself. His skin and muscles have melted. Nerve endings throughout his body have been destroyed. He lays in a dragon pit in front of 2 dragons that have just demonstrated their willingness to burn and eat human prey. The text explicitly states that his companions, including Garrus, retreated from the dragons. The notion that these men, having just witnessed their friend burned alive, would somehow rescue a charred corpse while 2 agitated dragons remain present defies all logic and textual evidence. What's more likely is that the men fled for their lives, and then once the dragons were gone, they went back into the pits to retrieve Quentyn. But this isn't exactly heroic, which would explain why they don't go into too much detail about how this happened. Supposing Quentyn somehow escaped the pit, then what? He can't eat. The interior and exterior tissue of his mouth and throat are burned. He also can't drink. The same tissue damage would prevent him from swallowing. In a modern hospital, severe burn victims require immediate fluid resuscitation, wound care, infection prevention, nutritional support through feeding tubes or IV lines, and often medically induced comas to spare them the agony. None of these interventions exist in Marine. And again, the text confirms that this is exactly what happened. Moreover, this isn't that kind of story. The series repeatedly demonstrates that far less severe injuries prove fatal in this world. Khal Drogo dies from an infected wound despite having skilled healers at his side. Jaime Lannister nearly dies of a fever after losing his hand. And Bran nearly dies from malnutrition from his fall. These characters receive immediate medical attention for injuries far less severe than total body burns, and they barely survive. The idea that Quentyn, who has 4th-degree burns across his entire body, is unable to really eat or drink, and who has only medieval medicine to attend to him, would survive, is a fantasy of an entirely different genre. Beyond textual evidence and medical reality lies a far more fundamental issue. Quentyn's death serves essential thematic purposes that his survival would undermine. Quentyn's death is the culmination of Martin's critique of fantasy's patriarchal assumptions about heroes, agency, and women who act as set dressing and mere trophies for male achievement. Sir Gareth Drinkwater gives Quentyn the name of Frog throughout their journey, a deliberate reference to Old English fairy tales about the princess and the frog. Quentyn sees himself as the frog who will be transformed into a beautiful prince if the dragon princess just gives him a chance, if she just kisses him, if she just recognizes his worth. In his mind, Daenerys should perform the emotional labor of seeing past his unremarkable exterior to the hero inside that he imagines himself to be, and she'll fall in love with him if he earns it through great deeds, as if her love is something that can be unlocked like some sort of video game achievement that he's entitled to. The text captures his delusion perfectly. He did not want to do this, but he saw no other way. Why else would Daenerys have shown me the dragons? She wants me to prove myself to her. Quentyn interprets every interaction through the lens of his fairy tale. When Daenerys shows him her dragons, he reads it as a romantic signal. The reality is far simpler. She's showing a visiting dignitary her most prized possessions and demonstrating her power. His inability to see her as anything other than the princess in his story, positioned at the end of his quest, placing her firmly on his pedestal, blinds him to her actual personhood and agency. Martin's subversion asks, why should the princess kiss the frog? Why does she need a prince at all? Daenerys is already a queen. She's already conquered cities, liberated slaves, and given birth to dragons. She's already complete. The premise that she requires a man, particularly an unremarkable one with delusions of grandeur, to fulfill her narrative is precisely the kind of fantasy that Martin wants to dismantle throughout the series. Quentyn's entire mission treats Daenerys as chattel to be claimed. He arrives to Meereen bearing a marriage contract negotiated in secret, binding her to terms she never knew or agreed to. The contract assumes her compliance, her availability, her fungibility as another piece of property. When he presents this document to her, he genuinely seems to expect her to honor it, once again displaying a grotesque sense of entitlement. Daenerys is positioned as property to be bought or bartered, a prize to be won by whoever presents the right words. That she might have her own desires, her own plans, her own assessment of what Dorne's support is worth, none of this seems to enter Quentyn or Doran's considerations. Daenerys refuses him politely but firmly. She has already married for political alliance to Hizdahr zo Loraq and found it unsatisfying. She has her own goals, her own vision for her future, and they do not include binding herself to a man because his father drew up a secret contract decades ago. Her refusal is an assertion of agency. This marriage contract is another chain, and she is the breaker of chains. She breaks it, as she has broken all others. This rejection completely destroys Quentyn's fragile male ego. His entire identity rests on being the hero of his story. When Daenerys refuses to play her assigned role as the prized damsel in distress, he cannot accept the failure. He cannot return to Dorne, having failed his father's mission, and, more importantly, his own heroic self-delusions. So he attempts to steal her dragons. Because, that's super heroic and romantic. The symbolism of Quentyn's final act is villainous. He approaches Rhaegal and Viserion with a whip, the tool of a slaver, the instrument of oppression. In a series where Daenerys' entire arc centers on abolishing slavery and asserting the fundamental dignity and freedom of all people, Quentyn arrives as the physical embodiment of the opposite principle. He views the dragons as property to be mastered, creatures to be dominated through force and the right bloodline. The dragons do not see a hero or a prince. They see another man with a whip, another oppressor, attempting to bind them. They respond with fire. This is Martin's most pointed critique of the Hidden Prince narrative. Quentyn has Targaryen blood. In a conventional fantasy, this would be sufficient. Blood magic would activate, the dragons would recognize their rightful master, and the overlooked prince would be finally validated. But Daenerys is not bonded with her dragons through blood alone. She walked into fire and survived. She fed them, raised them, and loved them. They're her children, bound to her through relationship and mutual recognition of their agency. Quentyn offers only bloodline and force and submission. The fairy tale that Quentyn imagines requires Daenerys to recognize him, to complete him, to validate his worth. She refuses. His attempt to take by force what she would not give freely ends exactly as it should, in flames. Quentyn's death is a good thing because it rejects the harmful premise that women exist as rewards for male achievement, that their agency is secondary to male destiny, that the so-called right man, the one with the noble blood, the heroic quest, who checks all the boxes, deserves to win the princess by virtue of being the protagonist. But Daenerys is her own protagonist, her own person engaged in her own story. His death demonstrates the consequences of treating women as objects to be won, rather than people with their own desires and goals. It demonstrates the futility of approaching dragons or women as property to be claimed through the right credentials and the right checkboxes. I know this is going to be shocking to many viewers, but maybe women are people. Arguments that Quentyn survived fundamentally misunderstand that this is one of the points of A Song of Ice and Fire. They insist on reading Quentyn as the secret protagonist, on finding ways to preserve his narrative importance, on maintaining the fairy tale that the overlooked prince proves himself and claims his reward. This reading requires ignoring that everything that Martin has built, a world where women have agency and where blood and destiny do not override personal capability and choice, where approaching queens and dragons as prizes to be won gets you burned alive. Quentyn's death unleashes Rhaegal and Viserion upon Meereen, creating chaos that shapes the subsequent events in the Winds of Winter. It devastates Prince Durant's carefully laid plans, showing the limits of scheming when you treat people with free will as pieces to be moved on a board. His death matters precisely because it happens, because it has consequences, and because the story doesn't bend to protect someone simply because they're high-born male and convinced of their own heroic destiny. His sister, Arianne, the actual heir to Dorne, remains alive and politically active. The contrast is pointed. The woman with actual agency and actual political acumen continues to actually shape events, while the boy who imagined himself to be the hero dies pursuing a fantasy where women exist only to validate his achievement. In conclusion, Quentyn Martell is dead. The text states this explicitly. The medical reality supports it, and the thematic architecture of the series requires it. Theories asserting that Quentyn has survived rest on misreadings of the distinction between dragon breath and dragon fire, scientifically false claims about human combustion, and a fundamental misunderstanding of what kind of story Martin is writing, and for whom. My frustration with these theories stems from their intellectual dishonesty, to be sure, but also from what they reveal about reader expectations. Insisting that Quentyn must be alive requires believing that Martin would undermine his careful deconstruction of fantasy tropes. It requires believing that the overlooked prince, really is the secret protagonist, and that his quest to claim the Dragon Princess as his prize will somehow succeed, and that female agency and the refusal of Daenerys cannot be the final word in a male character's arc, that her no doesn't really mean no. Quentyn Martell traveled to Meereen believing himself to be the frog in a fairy tale, destined to be transformed by the recognition of the princess. He died because he was wrong about the world, wrong about his role in it, and wrong about Daenerys Targaryen. She is no one's fairy tale princess. She does not exist to validate the delusions of self-important men. That is the story that Martin wrote, and it is a better story than the one in which Quentyn Martell survives.